The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Roosevelt Adult Education Center as Maya quietly pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor as she made her way down the familiar hallway. At 34, she felt older than most of the students rushing past her with their backpacks and coffee cups, chattering about weekend parties and upcoming exams. Maya had been working as a night shift cleaner at the local hospital for 12 years. Every night, she mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and wiped down surfaces while the world slept. Most people barely noticed her as she moved through the corridors in her blue uniform, invisible to doctors, nurses, and patients alike. But during the day, 3 times a week, she transformed into something different, a student. The music appreciation classroom was already half full when Maya slipped inside. She always chose the same seat in the back corner, away from the groups of younger students who clustered together near the front. Her notebook, edges frayed from constant use, sat open on the small desk as she carefully wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Professor Williams walked in carrying a stack of sheet music and his usual cup of coffee. He was a kind man in his 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. Maya liked him because he never made her feel foolish for asking questions, unlike some of her other instructors. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Williams said, setting his materials on the piano bench. "I hope you all listened to the Beethoven recordings I assigned. Today we're going to discuss how composers use musical themes to tell stories." Maya had listened to the recordings 3 times each. She found herself getting lost in the melodies, her mind wandering to places she rarely let it go anymore. Music had a way of awakening something deep inside her, something she had buried years ago, under layers of responsibility and survival. As the professor played examples on the classroom piano, Maya closed her eyes and let the notes wash over her. Her fingers, rough from years of cleaning chemicals and hard work, twitched slightly against her leg as if they remembered something her conscious mind refused to acknowledge. "Miss Rodriguez," Professor Williams called out, causing Maya to snap back to attention. "What do you think Chopin was trying to express in this passage?" Maya felt her cheeks grow warm as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and she preferred it that way. "I think maybe he was feeling homesick," she said quietly. "The melody sounds like someone remembering a place they can't go back to." The professor smiled and nodded. "Excellent observation. You have a good ear for emotional content in music." Some of the younger students exchanged glances. Maya caught a few of them looking at her with surprise, as if they hadn't expected the quiet older woman to have anything meaningful to contribute. She was used to being underestimated. It happened everywhere, at work, in her other classes. Even at the grocery store when cashiers spoke to her slowly as if she might not understand. After class, Maya packed her notebook carefully and waited for the room to empty before standing up. She had learned to avoid the rush of students heading to their next classes. Their energy and urgency reminded her too much of the life she might have had if things had been different. As she walked through the campus courtyard, Maya passed the music building where she could hear piano students practicing through the open windows. One student was struggling with a batch invention, playing the same passage over and over, each attempt slightly better than the last. Maya found herself slowing down, her ear automatically analyzing the student's technique and phrasing. She knew exactly what the student was doing wrong. The left hand was too heavy, drowning out the delicate melody in the right hand. The tempo was rushing in the difficult passages and dragging in the easier ones. Maya could hear these things as clearly as if someone was speaking to her, but she quickened her pace and pushed the thoughts away. At the bus stop, Maya sat on the worn wooden bench and pulled out her phone to check the time. She had 4 hours before her shift at the hospital started. Just enough time to go home, eat something, and try to get a little sleep. The bus arrived with a wheeze of air brakes, and Maya climbed aboard, nodding to the driver who recognized her as a regular passenger. During the 30-minute ride home, Maya stared out the window at the passing neighborhoods. She saw children playing in yards, mothers pushing strollers, elderly people tending their gardens. Normal lives filled with normal routines. She wondered sometimes what it would be like to have that kind of life, where your biggest worry was what to make for dinner or whether it might rain on the weekend. Her apartment was a small one-bedroom in a building that had seen better days. The walls were thin, and she could hear her neighbor's television through the plaster, but it was clean and quiet, and it was hers. Maya had worked hard for this small measure of independence, and she never took it for granted. In her tiny kitchen, she made a sandwich and sat at the card table that served as both dining table and desk. Her textbooks were stacked neatly on one side, homework assignments completed and waiting to be turned in. Maya was a good student, careful and thorough. She never missed assignments or showed up unprepared. Education was a gift she couldn't afford to waste. As she ate, her eyes drifted to the corner of the living room where an old keyboard sat covered by a sheet. She had bought it years ago at a garage sale, telling herself it would be good for her music theory homework. But she rarely uncovered it, and when she did, she played only simple scales and basic exercises. Nothing that might awaken the sleeping giant of memory and longing that lived inside her chest. After finishing her sandwich, Maya lay down on her narrow bed and closed her eyes. She tried to nap before work, but her mind kept drifting back to the morning's music class. Professor Williams had mentioned that they would need to prepare final projects for the end of the semester. Each student would be required to perform a piece that demonstrated their understanding of musical complexity and interpretation. The thought filled Maya with a mixture of excitement and dread. She loved music more than she could express, but performing was something else entirely. Performing meant being seen, being heard, being judged. It meant standing in front of people and revealing something real about yourself. Maya had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, and the idea of stepping into the spotlight, even briefly, terrified her. She rolled over and tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to her like shadows. In a few hours, she would put on her uniform and become the quiet cleaning woman again, moving through the hospital halls like a ghost. But for now, in the space between sleep and waking, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like when music was more than just something she studied, when it was something she lived and breathed and couldn't imagine living without. The alarm on her phone buzzed softly, pulling her back to the present. Time to get ready for work. Time to become invisible again. But as Maya sat up and reached for her uniform, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, whether she wanted it to or not. 3 weeks had passed since Professor Williams first mentioned the final project, and Maya could feel the weight of it growing heavier with each class. She watched as her younger classmates excitedly discussed their plans during break times, their voices filled with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about failing. "I'm doing Imagine by John Lennon," announced Katie, a 20-year-old art major with bright purple hair. "It's got deep meaning, and everyone knows it." "That's smart," replied Derek, adjusting his baseball cap. "I'm going with House of the Rising Sun. Classic rock always works." Maya listened quietly from her corner seat, pretending to review her notes while her stomach twisted into knots. She had been thinking about her project for weeks, and every idea felt either too simple or too complicated. The safe choice would be something basic, maybe a hymn she remembered from childhood church services. Amazing Grace was beautiful and meaningful, and she knew she could play it without embarrassing herself. After class, Maya gathered her things slowly, hoping to avoid the usual rush of students heading to the cafeteria. But as she reached the door, Professor Williams called out to her, "Maya, could you stay behind for a moment? I'd like to discuss your final project with you." Her heart sank. She had been hoping to fly under the radar, to submit her simple song. Choice and blend into the background as usual. Maya set her bag down and approached the professor's desk, where he was organizing sheet music. "I've been watching your participation in class," Professor Williams said, looking up at her with kind eyes. "You have excellent insights about musical interpretation. Your comments about Chopin last week were particularly thoughtful." "Thank you," Maya said quietly, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I'm concerned that you might be selling yourself short with your final project. When you mentioned possibly doing a simple hymn, I wondered if you might benefit from challenging yourself a bit more." Maya felt her palms grow sweaty. "I think a hymn would be appropriate. I know it well, and I understand the appeal of staying in your comfort zone," Professor Williams interrupted gently. "But this is your chance to really demonstrate what you've learned about musical complexity and emotional expression. I'd like to suggest something that would push you to grow as a musician." The professor stood up and walked to the piano, rifling through a stack of sheet music. Maya watched nervously as he pulled out a thick booklet and set it on the music stand. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," he announced, as if he had just solved all her problems. "It's a perfect example of romantic period composition. The technical demands are significant, but more importantly, it requires real emotional maturity to interpret properly." Maya stared at the sheet music, her mouth going dry. She knew this piece. She knew it better than Professor Williams could possibly imagine. But that was exactly the problem. "Professor, I really think that might be too difficult for me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've only been studying piano for a few months in this class. Maybe something simpler would be better." "Maya, I've been teaching for 23 years. I can tell when a student has natural musical ability, and you have it. Sometimes we need to have faith in ourselves and take risks." He pulled out a recording from his desk drawer and handed it to her. "Listen to this interpretation by Martha Argerich. Pay attention to how she brings out the emotional narrative of the piece, then try to find your own voice within it." Maya held the CD with trembling hands. "But what if I can't do it justice? What if I mess it up in front of everyone?" "Then you'll have learned something valuable about taking chances," Professor Williams said with a smile. "Besides, I have a feeling you might surprise yourself and everyone else." Other students had started filtering into the classroom for the next class, chatting loudly about their weekend plans. Maya felt trapped, standing there with the sheet music and recording in her hands like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed yet. "I really don't think," she began. "Maya, I'm going to be direct with you," Professor Williams said, lowering his voice. "I've noticed that you hold yourself back in many situations. You sit in the back, you speak quietly, you choose the safe options, but growth requires risk. This is your opportunity to step out of your comfort zone." Katie and Derek had taken their usual seats near the front and were openly staring at the conversation. Maya could see them whispering to each other, probably wondering what kind of trouble the quiet older student had gotten herself into. "Is everything okay?" Katie called out, her voice carrying that false concern that young people sometimes used when they smelled drama. "Everything's fine," Professor Williams replied. "Maya and I were just discussing her final project. She's going to be performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The whispers started immediately. Maya heard Derek let out a low whistle and mutter something to Katie about biting off more than you can chew. She felt her face burn with embarrassment and wanted nothing more than to disappear through the floor. "That's ambitious," Katie sighed, and Maya could hear the doubt in her voice. "Very ambitious," agreed another student who had been listening. "That's like conservatory-level stuff." Maya clutched the sheet music tighter and looked at Professor Williams with pleading eyes. But he seemed oblivious to her distress. In his mind, he was doing her a favor, pushing her to reach her potential. He had no idea that he was asking her to unlock a door she had spent 20 years trying to keep closed. "I'll expect to see some preliminary work next week," he said cheerfully. "Don't worry about perfection at first. Just focus on getting comfortable with the basic structure." As the classroom filled with more students, Maya realized she had no choice but to accept the assignment. Arguing further would only draw more attention, and she had already become the center of speculation. She nodded wordlessly and stuffed the sheet music into her bag. "Great! I'm excited to hear what you do with it," Professor Williams said, already. Turning his attention to setting up for the next class, Maya hurried out of the room, her face still burning with embarrassment. She could hear the whispered conversation starting behind her, students already placing bets on how badly she would struggle with such a challenging piece. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart. The sheet music felt like it was burning through her bag, demanding attention she wasn't ready to give. She thought about the old keyboard in her apartment, still covered by its sheet, and wondered if it was possible to keep hiding from yourself forever. As she walked toward the bus stop, Maya replayed the conversation in her head. Professor Williams meant well, but he had no idea what he was asking of her. He saw a student who needed encouragement to reach her potential. He didn't see a woman who had spent decades carefully constructing a life that kept her safe from the very thing he was now forcing her to confront. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, every stop reminding her that she was carrying something dangerous in her bag. By the time she reached her apartment, Maya had convinced herself that maybe she could find a way to decline the assignment. Maybe she could talk to Professor Williams privately and explain that she simply wasn't ready for such a challenge. But as she sat at her kitchen table and stared at the sheet music, Maya knew that wasn't really an option. She had worked too hard to get where she was to throw it all away now. Somehow she would have to find a way to play Chopin's Ballade without revealing the truth about who she really was. The question was whether that was even possible. For 3 days, the sheet music sat untouched on Maya's kitchen table like a sleeping snake. Every time she walked past it, her heart would skip a beat, and she would quickly look away. She went to work, attended her other classes, and tried to pretend that the assignment didn't exist. But Professor Williams had made it clear that he expected to see progress by the following week, and time was running out. On Thursday evening, after finishing her shift at the hospital, Maya found herself standing in front of her apartment building at 2 a.m, unable to bring herself to go inside. The night air was cool and quiet, with only the distant hum of traffic on the highway. She thought about the keyboard waiting in her living room, still covered by its protective sheet, and felt a familiar ache in her chest. 23 years had passed since she last played a real piano piece with any serious intent. 23 years since she had been forced to choose between her dreams and her family's survival. The memory still hurt, even after all this time. She had been 11 years old when her father was diagnosed with diabetes. The medical bills started piling up immediately, and her mother took on extra shifts at the diner where she worked. Maya's piano lessons, which had been the center of her world, suddenly became an unaffordable luxury. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had tried to continue the lessons for free, but Maya's mother's pride wouldn't allow it. "We don't take charity," her mother had said firmly, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Maya will understand someday." But Maya hadn't understood. All she knew was that one day she was preparing for regional competitions and dreaming of music conservatory, and the next day she was working after school at a local grocery store to help pay for her father's insulin. Now, standing outside her building in the middle of the night, Maya realized she couldn't avoid this forever. She climbed the stairs to her apartment and quietly unlocked the door, trying not to wake her neighbors. The sheet music was exactly where she had left it, mocking her with its complex notation and intimidating tempo markings. Maya picked it up with shaking hands and walked over to the keyboard in the corner. For the first time in months, she pulled away the protective sheet. The keys looked smaller than she remembered, worn and slightly yellowed with age. This wasn't the grand piano she had learned on as a child, or even the decent upright piano in her high school music room. But it would have to do. Maya sat on the wobbly bench and placed her fingers on the keys. They felt foreign and familiar. At the same time, like greeting an old friend after years of silence. She played a simple C major scale, wincing at how stiff her fingers felt. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of neglect, but it would take time to wake it up properly. The Chopin Bela began with a simple melody, deceptively peaceful before building into something much more complex. Maya had heard this piece countless times in her youth, had even attempted to play portions of it when she was 14. But she had never tackled the entire work, with all its technical demands and emotional depth. She started with just the opening measures, playing them slowly and carefully. Her fingers stumbled over passages that should have been second nature, and she felt frustration building in her chest. This was exactly why she had avoided serious playing for so long. The gap between what her mind remembered and what her hands could accomplish was too painful to bear. But as she continued to work through the opening section, something began to shift. The melody started to flow more naturally, and her fingers began to remember their old patterns. It was like learning to walk again after a long illness. Difficult and sometimes painful, but not impossible. By 4 in the morning, Maya had managed to play through the first page without major mistakes. Her hands ached and her back was sore from hunching over the keyboard, but she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of making music. The next night, she returned to the keyboard with renewed determination. This time, she worked on the second section, where Chopin's melody becomes more complex and demanding. The runs and arpeggios that had seemed impossible the night before began to take shape under her. Patient practice. Maya found herself losing track of time as she worked. The hospital night shift started at 11, which meant she had about 6 hours each evening to practice. She would come home, eat a quick dinner, and then sit at the keyboard until it was time to leave for work. Her neighbors probably thought she was crazy, playing piano in the middle of the night, but the thin walls of her building couldn't contain the music that was finally being released after decades of silence. As the days passed, Maya's playing grew stronger and more confident. Her fingers remembered techniques she thought she had forgotten, and her interpretation of the piece began to develop its own character. She wasn't just playing the notes anymore. She was telling Chopin's story, channeling emotions that had been locked away for far too long. The most difficult part wasn't the technical passages, though they were certainly challenging. It was the emotional vulnerability that the music demanded. Chopin's ballade was like a conversation between the composer and the listener, full of longing, passion, and heartbreak. To play it properly, Maya had to open doors in her heart that she had carefully sealed shut. One night, while working through a particularly beautiful passage in the middle section, Maya found herself crying. The melody was so achingly lovely, so full of everything she had given up and everything she had lost, that she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. She stopped playing and sat in the darkness of her apartment, letting the grief wash over her like a long overdue storm. But when the tears finally stopped, Maya felt something she hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in decades, she wasn't hiding from who she really was. She was a musician. She had always been a musician, even when life had forced her to become other things. The music was still there, waiting patiently for her return. As her playing improved, Maya began to notice changes in other areas of her life. She walked taller, spoke up more in her classes, and even smiled at her coworkers at the hospital. The music was healing something deep inside her, something she hadn't even realized was broken, but she was still careful to practice only when her neighbors were likely to be asleep or away. The last thing she wanted was for word to get back to Professor Williams or her classmates about her late-night sessions. Let them continue to think she was struggling with the basics. The truth would come out soon enough. 2 weeks before the performance date, Maya realized she had not only learned the entire ballad, but she had made it her own. Her interpretation was different from the recording Professor Williams had given her, more personal, more raw, filled with the experiences of someone who had lived through loss and found her way back to beauty. She could play the piece from memory now, her fingers finding their way across the keys without conscious thought. The music flowed through her like a river that had finally broken through a dam, carrying with it all the dreams and hopes she had thought were lost forever. But even as her confidence in the music grew, Maya felt a growing anxiety about the performance itself. Playing alone in her apartment at 2 in the morning was one thing. Playing in front of her classmates and professor was something else entirely. She would have to find a way to share this gift without revealing too much about where it came from. The question was whether that was even possible. The morning of the final presentations arrived gray and drizzly, matching Maya's mood perfectly. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing between excitement and terror. For weeks she had been preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Maya arrived at the music building 30 minutes early, hoping to find an empty practice room where she could run through the piece one more time. Her hands felt stiff with nerves, and she needed to warm up before facing the class. But every practice room was occupied with other students, doing last-minute preparations for their own performances. Through the small windows in the doors, she could see her classmates working on their pieces. Katie was running through Imagine for what sounded like the 100th time, her voice shaky with nervousness. Derek was practicing his guitar chords, stopping and starting repeatedly when he hit wrong notes. Everyone seemed to be struggling with pre-performance jitters. Maya found a quiet corner in the hallway and sat on a bench, trying to calm her racing heart. She closed her eyes and mentally played through the opening of the ballade, her fingers moving slightly as if she were actually at the piano. The music was solid in her mind. She knew every note, every phrase, every subtle dynamic change. But would her hands cooperate when it mattered most? "Hey Maya," Katie's voice broke through her concentration. "Are you ready for today?" Maya opened her eyes to see Katie approaching with Derek and 2 other classmates. They all looked nervous, but excited, the way students do before a big presentation. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be," Maya replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can't believe Professor Williams made you do that Chopin piece," Derek said, shaking his head. "That's like asking someone to climb Mount Everest for their first hiking trip." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Maya said with a weak smile. "I'm sure you'll do fine," Katie added quickly, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Just remember, it's about effort, not perfection. Professor Williams will appreciate that you tried something challenging." The other students nodded sympathetically, as if Maya were facing an impossible task that everyone knew she would fail. Their well-meaning encouragement only made her more nervous. They expected her to struggle, to make mistakes, to prove that Professor Williams had been wrong to push her so hard. And maybe they were right to expect that. At 10 o'clock sharp, Professor Williams opened the classroom door and invited everyone inside. The grand piano had been moved to the center of the room, with chairs arranged in a semicircle around it. Maya took her usual seat in the back, but today it felt more like hiding than preference. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Williams said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm he always brought to class. "I'm excited to hear what you've all prepared. Remember, this isn't just about technical skill. I want to hear your personal interpretation and understanding of your chosen pieces." He consulted his list and called the first name. "Let's start with Jennifer." Jennifer, a quiet psychology major, had chosen Scarborough Fair. She played it simply on her guitar, her voice sweet but trembling slightly. The performance was lovely in its simplicity, and everyone applauded warmly when she finished. Derek went next with House of the Rising Sun, his guitar work solid if not spectacular. He had clearly put in good practice time, and his confidence grew as he played. The room filled with the familiar melody, and several students nodded along with the rhythm. One by one, Maya's classmates performed their pieces. A folk song here, a pop ballad there, a simple classical piece that showcased basic technique. Each performance was met with encouraging applause and positive comments from Professor Williams. The atmosphere was supportive and relaxed, exactly what Maya had hoped for when she first suggested doing a simple hymn. But as her turn approached, Maya felt anything but relaxed. Her palms were sweating, and her mouth had gone completely dry. She watched Katie perform Imagine with reasonable skill, hitting most of the notes and conveying genuine emotion in her interpretation. The applause was warm and appreciative. "Very nice work, Katie," Professor Williams said. "I could hear your personal connection to the lyrics. Music is always more powerful when it comes from the heart." Maya's stomach clenched. She was next on the list, and there was nowhere to hide. "Professor." Williams looked at his paper and then directly at her. "Maya, you're up. I'm particularly looking forward to hearing what you've done with the Chopin." The room fell silent as Maya stood up on unsteady legs. She could feel everyone's eyes on her as she walked to the piano bench, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. They were probably wondering how badly she would embarrass herself, and honestly, Maya was wondering the same thing. She sat at the bench and adjusted the height slightly, her hands shaking as she placed the sheet music on the stand. But as her fingers found the keys for the first time in front of an audience in over 20 years, something strange happened. The familiar weight of the keys under her fingertips felt like coming home. Maya took a deep breath and began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade floated through the room like a gentle conversation, simple and beautiful. Maya felt her nervousness begin to fade as the music took over. This was what she had been born to do, what she had spent countless hours perfecting in the solitude of her apartment. Her fingers moved with growing confidence across the keys. As the piece developed and became more complex, Maya could sense a change in the room. The casual chattering and shifting in seats had stopped completely. Even Professor Williams, who had been writing notes about the previous performances, had put down his pen and was staring at her with surprise. The technical passages that her classmates had worried about flew under Maya's fingers with startling ease. Runs that should have challenged an advanced student sparkled with clarity and precision. But more than the technical skill, there was something deeper in her playing. An emotional maturity and understanding that transformed the difficult piece into something transcendent. Maya had found her voice in this music, pouring 23 years of suppressed longing and dreams into every phrase. The melody sang with the pain of loss and the joy of rediscovery. Each section told part of her story: the childhood prodigy, the sacrificed dreams, the long years of silence, and finally, the hesitant return to the thing she loved most. The room was completely still now, every person leaning forward slightly, as if afraid to miss a single note. Katie's mouth was hanging open in shock. Derek had completely forgotten about his nervousness and was listening with the intense focus of someone witnessing something extraordinary. Even the students who had been checking their phones were now giving Maya their complete attention. As the ballade built toward its dramatic climax, Maya felt tears beginning to blur her vision. But her fingers never faltered, carrying her through the most demanding passages with a skill that seemed to surprise even herself. The music was pouring out of her like water from a broken dam, unstoppable and pure. When she played the final gentle notes and lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed was profound. For several long seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Maya sat perfectly still, hardly believing what had just happened. She had revealed herself completely, and there was no taking it back now. Then Professor Williams began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. One by one, her classmates joined in until the room erupted in thunderous applause. But Maya barely heard it. She was staring at her hands, wondering where that performance had come from, and what it would mean for the carefully constructed life she had built in hiding. The applause seemed to go on forever, but Maya barely heard it. She sat frozen at the piano bench, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. 23 years of carefully hidden truth had just been exposed in 8 minutes of music, and she felt completely naked under the stares of her classmates. When the clapping finally died down, the silence that followed was even more overwhelming. Maya could feel everyone looking at her, trying to reconcile the quiet woman who cleaned floors at night with the musician who had just delivered a performance that belonged on a concert stage. Professor Williams was the first to speak, his voice filled with awe and confusion. Maya, that was extraordinary. I mean, truly exceptional. He walked closer to the piano, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. Where did you learn to play like that? Maya's throat felt tight, and she struggled to find words. The secret she had protected for so long was now lying in pieces around her, and she didn't know how to begin explaining. I used to play. When I was younger, she said quietly. Used to play? Derek interrupted, his voice loud with disbelief. That wasn't used to play. That was professional level. That was like conservatory graduate level. Katie was shaking her head in amazement. Maya, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us you could play like that? Why were you sitting in the back of class like you didn't know anything about music? The questions came fast now, voices overlapping as her classmates tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Maya felt overwhelmed by the attention, the very thing she had spent years trying to avoid. She looked toward the door, calculating if she could escape without answering, but Professor Williams stepped closer. Maya, please, he said gently. Help. U.S. understand. That performance was remarkable, but it's clear there's more to your story than you've shared. Maya took a shaky breath and looked around the room at the faces of her classmates. They weren't judging her or looking down on her anymore. Instead, they seemed genuinely curious and impressed, waiting for an explanation that she wasn't sure. She was ready to give. I started playing when I was 5, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother had an old piano, and I would sneak over to her house to play it when my parents were working. She paused, remembering those early days when music felt like magic, when every new song she learned opened up a whole world of possibilities. When I was 7, my parents finally agreed to let me take lessons. Mrs. Patterson was my teacher, and she said I had natural talent. By the time I was 10, I was performing in regional competitions and talking about music conservatory. Professor Williams sat down in one of the student chairs, listening intently. What happened? Maya felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one that always came when she thought about those lost years. My father got sick when I was 11. Diabetes, but back then the medical care wasn't as good as it is now. The bills started piling up immediately, and my mother had to work double shifts just to keep up. The room was completely quiet now, everyone hanging on her words. Piano lessons became a luxury we couldn't afford. Mrs. Patterson offered to teach me for free, but my mother wouldn't accept charity. I had to get a job after school to help with the medical expenses. Maya's voice cracked slightly. I never played seriously again after that. But Maya, Katie said softly, you didn't lose your ability. What you just played was incredible. Why didn't you go back to music when things got better? Maya shrugged, though the gesture felt heavy with years of regret. Things never really got better. My father died when I was 16, and by then I was so far behind other musicians, my age that catching up seemed impossible. Besides, my family needed me to work. Music felt like a childhood dream that I had to put away. Professor Williams leaned forward in his chair. So you've been working and taking care of your family all this time? Working, yes. Taking care of my mother until she passed 5 years ago. I've been cleaning at the hospital for 12 years now. Maya finally looked up from her hands to meet his eyes. Coming back to school was something I promised myself I'd do someday, but I never planned to do this. She gestured toward the piano, where the sheet music still sat open to Chopin's demanding score. Why didn't you tell me about your background? When I assigned this piece, Professor Williams asked, I would have understood if you had explained. Because I was afraid, Maya admitted. I was afraid that if people knew I used to play, they would expect things from me that I couldn't deliver. Anymore. I was afraid that if I tried to be that person again and failed, it would hurt too much. Derek was shaking his head in amazement. But you didn't fail. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard anyone play in person. It really was, agreed Jennifer, who had been quiet until now. I got goosebumps listening to you. It was. Like the music was telling a story. Maya felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. It was telling a story. It was telling my story. All those years of missing music, of wondering what might have been. When I finally started practicing this piece, it all came pouring out. Professor Williams stood up and walked back to the piano, placing his hand gently on the keyboard. Maya, I owe you an apology. I pushed you to do something you weren't comfortable with, thinking I was helping you grow as a student. I had no idea I was asking you to revisit such a painful part of your past. No, Maya said quickly. Don't apologize. You were right to push me. I needed this. I needed to stop hiding from who I really am. The professor smiled warmly. And who are you really, Maya? She thought about the question for a moment, feeling something shift inside her chest. For the first time in decades, the answer felt clear. I'm a musician, she said, and the words felt like coming home. I've always been a musician, even when I couldn't admit it to myself. As news of Maya's performance spread through the music building, other students and even faculty members began stopping by to congratulate her. Word traveled fast in the small college community, and by the end of the day, Maya found herself invited to audition for the community symphony and offered private students who wanted to learn from someone with her obvious skill. Dr. Rodriguez, the head of the music department, personally sought her out to discuss scholarship opportunities and the possibility of pursuing a music degree. Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted, she told Maya earnestly. We would be honored to help you develop it further. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from her fellow night shift workers at the hospital. When word reached them about their quiet colleague's hidden talent, they were amazed but not entirely surprised. I always knew there was something special about you, said Linda, one of the nurses Maya had worked with for years. You hummed while you worked, and it was always perfect pitch. We just thought you liked music. As Maya drove home that evening, still processing everything that had happened, she realized that revealing her secret hadn't destroyed her carefully constructed life. It had simply made it more honest. She was still the same person who worked hard, cared for others, and pursued her education with determination. But now she was also allowing herself to be the musician she had never stopped being. The keyboard in her apartment no longer needed its protective sheet. For the first time in over 20 years, Maya Rodriguez was ready to make music not just in the shadows of night, but in the full light of day. And that felt like the most beautiful song of all.